Well, thank you very much for some very interesting contributions from the three previous speakers, and also for the praise of some of my former colleagues. I know that many people, good people, go into these agencies with the best of intentions to protect our national security and our way of life. However, of course, it's not all roses, as I'm sure you will expect me to say a little bit about tonight. In the 1990s, I was employed as an MI5 intelligence officer, and there I met my former colleague and partner, David Shaler, as was mentioned in the introduction. And we saw a number of things going wrong. And this was in a fairly ethical era of MI5's 100-year existence, because they had just been put on a legal footing for the first time in 1989. And this is before 9/11, when some of the more extreme practices came into being. But despite that, we did see a number of things going wrong, which included files on government ministers, bombs that could and should have been prevented, which were planted by the provisional IRA on UK streets, which exploded and killed innocent people, and then the spies lying to government about their mistakes in those operations. Illegal telephone taps, innocent people going to prison, and also MI6 funding an assassination plot against Colonel Gaddafi of Libya in 1996, which was not approved by the Secretary of State, Sir Malcolm Rifkind, at the time, and which obviously didn't achieve its objective, which was to assassinate Gaddafi, but did kill innocent people. So that was a range of things that we saw going wrong. This is well documented at the time of the whistleblowing in the late 1990s, where David Shaler became a rather notorious, very famous whistleblower when he exposed these issues. And by doing so, and by my helping him, we found ourselves literally having to go on the run around Europe. We did an Edward Snowden years ago. And he had to live in hiding for a year. He had to live in exile in France for 3 years. And he went to prison not once but twice. First of all, when the British government failed to extradite him in 1998. And then secondly, after he had returned to the UK voluntarily to stand trial for a breach of the Official Secrets Act and was inevitably found guilty for his whistleblowing. So I just mentioned that as a sort of run-up to why I want to say what I'm saying now. And one of the key points, of course, of tonight's debate is the issue of privacy. Privacy versus security, liberty versus security. Having done something rather extreme in the 1990s, having gone on the run and blown the whistle and crossed the intelligence agencies, I know from experience what it is like to live without a sense that you can have privacy in your life, where you can't guarantee that your communications are not being intercepted. You can't even feel you can have a conversation with your mother about a family issue without the possibility that it is being recorded. Where you can't also guarantee privacy in your own home because there might be bugs in your flat or in your house, even in your own bedroom. And where also there might be the possibility of some of your friends being pressured to report back on you to the intelligence agencies. And all I can say from that is whether or not that happened, whether or not that was realistic, and I think probably in the first few years that probably was a realistic threat assessment from our point of view, just the possibility of not having privacy is very corrosive to the human spirit, to your relationships, to the sense that you can't feel free to talk openly, and where you begin to self-censor what you might be reading and ingesting over the internet. So fast forward now, where we're looking at a much wide-ranging surveillance capability against all of us with the internet and the new technologies, where none of us now, in the wake of Edward Snowden, can guarantee that we have privacy in our communications. What is the impact for us? Well, again, it's not just corrosive necessarily to the human spirit, to the fact we might begin to self-censor. It is also corrosive, potentially, to our very way of life, to our democracy. Because if we feel that we are not private, we will start to self-censor what we read, what we write, what we say, what we plan, how we associate. We even lose, basically, our freedom of conscience, effectively, because we self-censor. We worry that what we say now might be used against us. And while that isn't necessarily the case now, of course, laws can change, as they did in the 1930s Germany. So what you might be doing now, as an innocent activist out there on the street waving a placard in a just cause, or getting involved in an Occupy camp, if your information, even the basic metadata, who you're associating with, who you're in contact with, is collected and stored for a number of years, and then the laws might change, that information could in the future be used against you for what you're doing legitimately now. And if that sounds fanciful, just think back to a couple of years ago when the Occupy camp was in the City of London. And a letter was leaked from the City of London police warning the neighbouring banks that they deemed the Occupy group to be potentially domestic extremists / terrorists. So if any of you were in the Occupy camp, you may well have quite an interesting file. So if the laws shift, if you suddenly you are part of an organisation that in the future might be deemed to be more of a threat, and the basic communications data now is being stored for future use, you can see the dangers that might be facing each and every one of us. So this is why it's important, why privacy is such a fundamental right. And I think that the basic argument that we hear time and time again from the security and intelligence community, that there is a balance between liberty and security, is actually bogus. The core issue here is our right to privacy. And Matthew mentioned all the fights, the decades, the centuries, where we in Europe, we in the West have fought, our ancestors fought, for a whole range of basic human rights, which were of course enshrined magnificently in 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they were enshrined for a reason then, to prevent in the future the horrors that had just been visited on the world during World War II, to prevent those sort of abuses happening again on that scale. And I would suggest that we have become bloated with ease and we have become complacent in the West because we have had 60, 70 years of peace, where we don't value the importance of these basic rights, why we have them. And in the name of protecting us against this nebulous, ever-increasing, ever-mutating terrorist threat, we seem quite happy to allow them to slide away, to slip through our fingers. And I find that interesting because when I was involved in the intelligence agencies where I worked there, one of the key threats at that time was the Irish terrorist groups. And realistically, on the streets of London, I remember there being security alerts virtually every day, and there'd be tube problems and things trying to get home from work. But actually, realistically, there were bombs going off on a fairly regular basis on our city streets, where people would be killed or injured. And there were debates, of course, around the balance between liberty and security and, do we take away rights to protect ourselves against the provisional IRA? And yet we didn't, largely. And now, when we face a far more nebulous threat and a far less realistic daily or weekly threat on our streets from this sort of nebulous global terror, we've given away so many of our rights so unthinkingly. And I think that is a real problem for our democracy, for our way of life. And it's the democracy and way of life which the intelligence agencies specifically are there, supposedly, to protect. I do agree, though, that the balance, and it's great that there is an increasing awareness and increasing debate around this. But one of the issues we have in how we regulate and oversee and control our intelligence agencies is trying to define exactly what they're there to do. Now, it says that they are there to protect our national security and the economic well-being of the UK. But actually, for the purposes of law, my understanding is that national security has never been legally defined for the purposes of law in this country. And we see time and time again, often with lazy journalists, as well as rent-a-quote people in the media, that national security is very often conflated with the national interest or the public interest or whatever. And that is not what the intelligence agencies are there to protect. It's only the national security angle. And I would suggest that national security is actually anything that poses a threat to the existence of the UK, an existential level threat, such as we faced during the Second World War. And I would suggest we haven't actually faced anything at that level since. Sure, it's terrible if a bomb goes off or a spectacular happens, people die, it's a terrible crime, but it is not an existential threat to our national security. So to give away our rights so thoughtlessly, I think is damaging our democracy more than the threat of terrorism ever could. Now, we do have these intelligence agencies, and Hazel is absolutely right. Of course, they are much more accountable than they used to be. The first accountability began in 1994 with the Intelligence Services Act, as she mentioned, and the establishment of the Intelligence and Security Committee in Parliament in 1994, which until last year, has only been responsible for looking at policy, finance and administration and could not investigate operational matters. And in fact, I remember, because I was on the inside when this law came into being, and there was a bit of trepidation from the spy community at that time, how much oversight will we have to submit to in Parliament? And when the ISA came out, there was relief all round. they realised that actually it was quite a light burden of accountability. And so it proved to be for 20 years. But it's fantastic now that there is more scope for operational investigations. I think that is crucial, especially because we have had evidence over the last decade or so that top spies and top police officers have been, should we say, economical with the truth when talking to the ISC, and the ISC members have no way of knowing. They had no powers to compel evidence, to compel information to come out. And we know this because Sir Stephen Nanda, former head of MI5, has said publicly he blanched at what he did not tell the committee. We've had Lord Blair now, who was caught out lying to the committee about how many terrorist atrocities had been stopped between 2005 and 2008. He doubled the number. Shades of General Alexander talking to Congress in America post-Snowden. And we've also had MI5 boss Sir Jonathan Evans having to admit that his predecessor had been less than frank about possible spy complicity in torture. And it was very easy for them to get away with this. So it's great that there are more powers. But it's also very easy in terms of oversight. And there are other mechanisms we can talk about. Just briefly, we have the commissioners that can go in and oversee interception of communications, of intelligence and matters like that. But again, I know from the inside, and this has been said before, it is very easy for the intelligence officers to game that process, to ensure that these people are not given full access to the people they need to speak to about ethical concerns and things that might have gone wrong. So it is very much a balance. It's fantastic that the debate is starting. It's somewhat concerning that actually the debate is much more controlled, much more anodyne within the UK than it has been across many other Western countries and even in America, where they've had congressional hearings and changes to the regulation of the NSA. So I hope that this continues. I'm sure it will, because there will be plenty more information coming out from Mr. Snowden and his disclosures. We will see a greater debate. So it's a good start, but I would love to see it moving faster, and I would love to see people more aware of what is at stake here if we allow our democracy to slide away further and our privacy to be eroded yet further. We will end up in a surveillance dystopia. Thank you.
Okay, I've promised to open the floor. My intention at the minute is to probably try and steal a bit more time for us to continue, but